Dr. Broadwell is going to talk about Timucua miracle stories, European folklore through the eyes of Florida Indians. Dr. Broadwell.
Thank you. So you all know a little bit from this morning's things about the Timucua language, so I won't go through that, but I wanted to talk a little bit about a very interesting part of this corpus of Timucua language material, which are things that are called exempla. Exempla are little moral stories from European originals. Typically, they are stories of miracles or intercessions of the Virgin or something of that sort. And so I want to talk this afternoon about the social hierarchies that are present in these stories and explore the way in which the Timucua translated not only the language of the stories, but also the social stratification of the exempla into indigenous terms. So if we think in terms of background, and how does language indicate social status or honor? Most languages have some way of indicating this, often through special words or lexical items. So in English, we might address someone as Dr. So-and-so, Sir so-and-so, Lord so-and-so, right? Or in some other language like Spanish, we might have different pronouns, tú versus usted, for degree of intimacy or respect. But you also get in some languages grammatical markers for honor. The best known example from the Americas is Nahuatl. So in Nahuatl, there's a way to say the house, but also if you want to talk about house in an honorable way, there's a special suffix here, tzin, that goes on the noun, and that tells you it's an honorable house. Or for an ordinary person, you say he or she died, omik. But if you want to say an honorable person died, you say omomikili, right? So the verb inflects differently for honorable and non-honorable subjects. This works for second person and third person subjects or objects in Nahuatl, but there are no honorifics for first person subjects or objects. That's probably true for most languages around the world. Typically, you don't index your own social status linguistically, you index the social status of other people. Okay. So there's been no previous description of the honorific system of Timucua, but by studying the corpus, I found that there are three main parts of this system. There's a particle ano, which is used when a subject, object, or possessed noun is honored. There's also a special form of the possessive suffix, mitono, which is used when a second or third person possessor or possessed is honored. And there's also a special use of the passive suffix ni when the subject is honored. And because our corpus is primarily composed of Christian Timucua text, we don't really know exactly how this system worked prior to contact. However, the two letters from the middle of the 17th century show the same honorific system in operation in addressing European authorities like the King of Spain. And the complexity of this system also argues against the idea that it's some sort of European or Christian invention. In particular, the Timucua system does not correspond to any European language. It's not a translation of a Spanish or a Latin or any other system. It is quite similar in some ways to Nahuatl and some other Mesoamerican languages, but to my knowledge, not similar to any other North American language. Languages that have these extensive systems of grammatical honorific marking, there's this interesting correlation between linguistics and social structure there. You find these almost entirely in languages with very high degrees of social stratification. So you get these a lot in Southeast Asia, for example. Thai is famous for an elaborate system, Japanese as well, the Aztec case. Typically you don't get these in societies where there's not something like a royalty, basically, which is very socially stratified relative to ordinary people. So we know that Timucua society had social stratification, but a lot of the details of the system are unclear. In John's talk this morning, we saw something about the hierarchy of the different lineages of the Timucua, and we know there was this extensive honorific, or this extensive system of social stratification, but I don't think that we knew anything about how it was indexed linguistically prior to this. So, a couple of questions. Who triggers honorific marking? So in these texts, the usual people who trigger the honorific are deities like God, Jesus, and the Virgin Mary, royal persons like kings, religious authorities like priests and bishops, and in one or two texts, parents, although usually not. To understand this system, you have to understand point of view here. So honorifics involve a relationship between two people, right? And I'm going to use just a little bit of linguistic jargon here. So here we mean, by the self, we mean the person whose point of view is represented. So if I'm talking to you, then it's my self is the person whose point of view is involved. If, let's say, Joe is speaking to Bill, then Joe's point of view with respect to Bill is represented. Okay? And the other sort of technical term is the focus of deference. So the focus of the deference is the person whose social status is going to be indexed linguistically. Okay? So you can think of honorifics as what linguists call social deixis. So deixis is telling you how close or how far is something from you. The kind that we're familiar with in English is here, tells you it's close to me. There tells me it's far from me, in space, right? Then we also have temporal deixis. Now is close to me in time. Then is far from me in time. Okay? So social deixis means close to me in social status. And honorific means far from me in social status, right? So two high status people are close to each other socially. A commoner and a royal are far from each other. So these honorifics are mapping how much distance is there between the two people in the text. So in general, what we find is that the honorific is used when the self is lower on the social hierarchy than the focus of deference. So let's work through some of these linguistic indications of honor in Timucua, and then we'll look at some stories that use them and show the relations between the characters in the stories. So the first one I want to talk about is a particle ano, and there are at least 3 different kinds of ano in the text. As I think I said in the question period at lunch to a few people, we only have the spelling of this language in Roman letters. It's possible that there might have been some distinction, like maybe some vowels were long and some were short, maybe some were stressed in a different way, maybe there was tone, something else that is not linguistically represented in the spelling system. But one sense of ano is just person. So, for example, this God, how many persons is he? Is he one person? Person in that religious sense, like a person of the Trinity, is ano. Ano can also mean relative, as in chitako anoya, who are your relatives? Okay? But the third sense is the one that I want to talk about today. That's the one that's the honorific particle. And we can tell a little bit of differences between the honorific ano and the noun senses, where it means person or relative. So the honorific shortens to just an before a word that starts with a vowel. In the dialect in the Jesus Maria letter, that's the mid-17th century letter, this honorific is spelled ani, A-N-I, rather than A-N-O. But ano, meaning person, continues to be spelled A-N-O, I believe, in that document. The honorific appears immediately before a verb with no suffix, but mostly nouns in this language tend to have suffixes. So when it means person or relative, it almost always has some suffix on it. Okay. So here are some examples. So this is from Movia 1635. This book has about 25 exempla at the end and an appendix. And this is from a story that I'm calling The Devoted Shepherdess. In this story, there's a young woman who's she's raised by a devout Christian father who takes her every day to pray at a shrine. And then when her father dies, she continues the practice of going every day to this shrine to the Virgin. But she notices that the statue of the Virgin at the shrine, that its clothing is bad. It's sort of falling apart, deteriorating. So with great devotion, she speaks to the Virgin Mary and she says, "O Holy Mary, eternal Virgin, my honored Lord, my honored Lord Jesus Christ, honored mother, woman chief of heaven and earth, I regret that you wear clothes that are bad. And all the places where I've got the red here, the honorific mark is used in Timucua, because if you think about the relationship between the poor shepherdess and the queen of heaven, they could not be further apart in the hierarchy. So with great humility, the shepherdess addresses the Virgin Mary using this particle. If we look at the first example here, it's in this phrase here, ananokona. Okay, so na means my, anoko is Lord, an is the honorific little particle contracted before a vowel. And if we ask, my honored Lord, is it the possessor, my, or is it the possessed, the Lord who is honored? It seems there it must be the Lord, right? So it's marking a possessed, an honored possessed thing. We might ask when we look at things like anisomitonoma, that is found right here, and that means his honored mother, where his is Jesus Christ, my Lord's honored mother. There you might think Jesus is honored, his mother is honored. What is the particle showing? Given the usual pattern, it seems to be indicating respect towards Mary here, rather than to Jesus. We also get ano with honored subjects. So here's a very nice passage. This is from Pareja's 1612 baptism, where it contrasts the properties of the devil and God. So he says, what does God give you if you follow him, and what does the devil give you if you follow him? Okay. The devil is without good things to give. He gives those who serve him eternal pain and stench and other things like this. Okay. The word give is oho, sometimes spelled O-J-O, sometimes O-H-O. Okay. And then contrast, that's just the ordinary verb. Now we contrast that with what God gives, but God gives health, gives life, gives possessions, food to eat, children, all good things. And each instance of the verb give here now is preceded by this an prefix. Anohoke, 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 or anahoke. I don't know why they spelled it that way. But notice now, when God is the subject, God is honored. And so each time God is mentioned as the subject of a verb, we get the prefix. But when the devil is the subject, we don't get the prefix, right? We also sometimes get it for honored objects. So ano tamola tala means I beg you, and Pareja in his arte says persona de respeto. I beg you to a person of respect. Here's another example from Movia 1637, talking about the story of Longinus. Longinus was the soldier who pierced the side of Christ and later became a convert and a saint. So it says, Longinus, saw him, Jesus, when they tortured him on the cross. So he saw him as Jesus. So to show honor to Jesus, we put ano before the verb see. And when they tortured him, and him is the object of the verb torture, so once again we get the honorific particle. Essentially, anytime Jesus is the subject or object, or the possessor, or the possessed, we tend to get ano. Okay, so that was the first of the three linguistic indicators of honor. The second is the special form for his or her. This is the suffix mitono. So God's mother here is Dios hizo mitono mano. And here the ordinary form would just be the mi instead of the mitono. I think we'll see a contrast in a second. Another example is by the grace of our honored Lord Jesus Christ. And here, Jesus Christ possesses the word grace. In other words, Jesus is grace. So Jesus is the possessor of grace. Therefore, we get honorific marking on grace. The third marker of honor in Timucua is a special use of the passive suffix ni. So there is an ordinary ni, passive. So we get a lot of examples in the text of contrast between active and passive verbs. So for example, Tolobosotela means explains. Tolobosonila means is explained. Okay? And whenever the subject of the sentence is Jesus or God, the verb almost always goes into the passive. So we have here, in this example, God wanted it to be so for him, and then, but this verb want is followed by the ni honorific passive. So literally it's something like, God was wanted it to be so for him. And that is true in Timucua, even if the verb is intransitive. So just a background, if you think about English, you can say, John ate the apple was eaten by John. Okay, that's because eat is a transitive verb. Transitive verbs have active and passive forms. In English, intransitive verbs don't have both forms. So we say, John died, but not John was died, right? Intransitives don't have passives in most languages, but in Timucua, if the subject is honored, then it does have the passive. So in the text, Jesus Christ was died. And what we find in the text is this very consistent pattern. Every time the death of Christ is mentioned, the verb is in the passive. Every time someone else in the text dies, it's in the regular form. So that's the third indication of honor. Okay. So now with that basic background, I want to talk about a couple of these exempla, look at the characters and their social relationship to each other, and see how that's indexed in the text. So the first exemplum I want to tell you about is one that I'm calling Bishop Andres and the Tempting Demons. So this story comes from Europe. It's a pretty great story. So what's happening is there's this Bishop Andres, and he's got this young woman who is living in his house as a servant. Then the scene suddenly shifts. We kind of set this up, and then we shift. There's a Jew walking down the road. And he becomes overcome with fatigue, and he has to go and take a nap in a cave. And while he's in the cave, he overhears this giant meeting of demons. At the front of the meeting of the demons is the chief demon. And he's saying, okay, tell me what you've all been up to. Who have you been tempting? Who have you been tempting? What have you been up to? So one demon says, I'm working on Bishop Andres. He's got this very attractive woman living in his house, and I am tempting him to sin with her. Yesterday, he went so far as to put his hand on her back. And I'm going to continue to tempt him. The chief demon says, that is really great. Keep up with it. Get the bishop to sin with this woman, and you'll really be, in good shape here among us. Demons, you'll be up for promotion, you'll be up for tenure among the demons. Okay, so then the Jew wakes up in the cave, having heard all this from the demons, and he goes out onto the road to the nearby town. He asks around until he finds the bishop. And then he comes to the bishop and he says, I know that you are being tempted to sin with this woman. The bishop says, oh, no, not me. I am a bishop. The Jew says, no, I know what's happening. Finally, the bishop repents. He goes and confesses his sin, and the Jew is converted. And that's the happy end of a typical Catholic morality story. Okay. So, what's interesting about this story linguistically is there are multiple points of view. So there's kind of a neutral narrator who's telling you about things that are going on. He's telling you about the Jew walking down the road, him traveling here and here. There's also the point of view of the demon, the little demon who is recounting to the head demon his project to tempt Bishop Andres. And there's also the point of view of the Jew who goes and confronts the bishop about his temptation. So, what's interesting is in this story, the narrator doesn't use honorific marking for the bishop, but the Jew who meets Bishop Andres does use honorific marking in speaking to him. And the way we could interpret that is the narrator and the demon consider themselves to be equal to the bishop, but the Jew thinks that he is worse than the bishop. He's at a lower social status than the bishop. The way we can tell this is the demon refers to the bishop without the honorific. He says, as for Bishop Andres, a woman is living in his house and working for him, and I want to tempt him. And when he says living in his house, he says living in pahamima. Me is the ordinary agreement, right? So that's not honorific, that's just ordinary. But now, a couple of lines later, the story happens. The Jew finds the bishop, and he says to him, the devil has caused temptation, caused to be tempted, to be near, has caused to be near temptations to your heart. And for a long time, a woman has been living in your honored house, right? So the Jew addresses the bishop with honor, but the narrator does not, and the demon does not. So there's a fairly simple scheme of deference in this story. There's the narrator. He's essentially on the same level as the bishop. Then there's the servant and the demon. The Jew is positioned lower in the social hierarchy. Surprise, Catholic colonial Spain, right? Okay. So now let's look at one that's a little bit more complicated. I briefly mentioned this story to you before. This is the Devoted Shepherdess. So I think I told you the first few steps of this. So I told you there's this devoted shepherdess. She goes every day to pray. Her parents die, and she lives near the shrine. Okay. So then once again, it's a very, very popular kind of technique in these stories. It's like in modern day movies where suddenly you shift to another action. Some stuff is happening, and then you go back to the first action. So at this point in the story, we shift to two priests who are walking down the road near the shepherdess. They stop to rest, and one falls asleep. So the priest who is awake sees three processions of maidens, and each group of maidens has a different kind of clothing. He asks the leader of the procession who they are and where they're going, and although he doesn't know it, the leader is the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary explains the three processions are virgin martyrs, and each one has a different level of sanctity. So one group, I believe, is women who kept their chastity but did not enter a religious order. And the second is women who were chaste and became nuns. And the third is women who were chaste, became nuns, and were martyred for it. Okay. So the Virgin Mary explains they're going to go to the house of the devoted shepherdess who is dying. Okay. And then the sleeping priest awakes, and he tells a dream which is identical to what his companion saw. So then they hustle off, they ask the villagers, they find the shepherdess, and they witness the virgin at her deathbed. And the Virgin Mary consoles the shepherdess dies, and the angels take her up to heaven at the end of the story. So there are actually a lot of points of view in this story. A lot of different people speak to each other, a lot of different social levels. So the narrator talks about the Virgin Mary, the shepherdess, and the virgin martyrs. The shepherdess speaks to the Virgin Mary. The priest speaks to the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary speaks to the priest, the shepherdess, and she also refers to her son Jesus. So when the shepherdess refers to the virgin, I think you've seen this one before. O Holy Mary, eternal virgin, my honored Lord Jesus' honored mother, right? So the shepherdess here is the self, the virgin is the focus of deference. So the shepherdess shows deference to the virgin. The narrator, however, does not show deference to the virgins or the virgin martyrs. When the unnamed virgins are not described deferentially, we just say they greeted him reverentially. But the most holy virgins are the virgin martyrs, Saints Lucia and Inez, and they are described reverentially. So the narrator says, because they were chaste and they entered religious orders, the infidels basically wanted to kill the honorable Saint Inez and Saint Lucia, and we know that they're honorable because after the verb they wanted to kill them, we get the ni passive. Okay. We don't get any ni here for greeting. So ordinary virgins are fairly low in deference, but the virgin martyrs are high in deference. The priest, when he meets the Virgin Mary, at first he doesn't know who she is. She's just this beautiful maiden he meets. But somehow the linguistics kind of gives it away a little bit, because he says to her, may it be explained to me who you are and where y'all are going? And the way that we know that he's showing honor is he says, may it be revealed, or may you reveal to me, using the honorific, where, and here we get the second plural, where you and your companions are going. And yeah, that's right. And yes, may it be revealed to me who you are, may it be revealed to me where you are going. By the way, here the Spanish doesn't actually have the quote, but you can tell from looking at the Timucua that it's actually direct quotation. It's not, the Spanish says, he asked her to tell him who she was. But the Timucua says, he asked, please tell me who you are and where you're going. Okay. The narrator initially shows, let me see. Yes, initially the narrator doesn't use deference towards the shepherd. We talk about, he said this to so-and-so, and when she had done this, her father, so we get ordinary her here, not honorific her. But at the end of the story, after she dies, she's carried to heaven by the angels, and she undergoes this change of status. She's now become a saint in heaven. So it says, the group of virgins which accompanied her took her soul, and the first time her soul has the ordinary her agreement. But then at the end it says, and then they took her soul using the honorific. And you might think, well, is the honorific passive here, is that used because the subject of this is the angels taking her up, or is it because the shepherdess is now dead and an angel or a martyr in heaven? And it seems like it has to be the shepherdess, because the angels and the other heavenly virgins were not described with honorifics before this. So I think that what's happening is that after she dies and her soul is taken up, she becomes honorable at the end. So the overall scheme of deference here is this fairly complicated system of Jesus and God at the top, Virgin Mary slightly below them, the virgin martyrs Saints Inez and Lucia below them, the dead shepherdess slightly below them, and then all the live people and the unnamed virgins below that. And so there's considerable dexterity in this honorific system. We can also see, though, that the hierarchy doesn't completely reproduce a European Catholic worldview. In particular, note that angels, living people, and priests are in the same non-deferential status. And in fact, it's interesting, no live person here shows deference to another living person. They only show deference to deities and people in heaven, basically. So, let's switch from these moral stories, these exempla, to the secular text. There are two surviving letters in Timucua written to Spanish authorities. They both show the same use of honorifics in addressing Spanish people of high rank. So the 1651 Timucua letter starts, "Na neme anoque la mitonoma," and on like that. And that means we have always lived as your honored servants. And here, anoquela is servant, mitono is your honored. So this is the servant here that's being addressed is the King of Spain. So we are the servants of the King of Spain, addressing the king with honor. And now it says once again, very full-heartedly, we are your servants, and we want to talk to you. And then we have the ano here, because the object of this verb, talk to, is an honored person. The Jesus Maria letter also has this system. So it starts off, our honored Lord, representing the king. This is addressed to not to the king himself, but to his representative. And here we get the honored prefix here, and here at the end, we are speaking to you, and we get both of these markers. So we get the ni honorific passive as well as the on prefix here. So the secular texts show deference to secular authorities, just like sacred texts show deference to spiritual authorities. We can say basically then that there are two kind of speech styles in Timucua. We could say there's something like basic third-person narration where there are no special honorifics used, even when potential targets of deference are present. And we can call this plain talk. That's especially characteristic of simple narration. So here's an example. The previously mentioned Christians were happy and praised God. It would have been possible to use some honorifics in here to praise God, but not every potential case of honor is actually signaled linguistically by honor. Most frequently, we get the linguistic indication of honor when there's direct quotation. And that's the kind that we can call reverent talk. So if I'm directly addressing you, I tend to use reverent talk. And occasionally we get it in some narrative text as well. Here's an example. This is a story of St. Clare. St. Clare was in a monastery with her nuns when she was attacked by Saracens. And so she cries out to God to help them. And she says something like, "Oh God, these your honored servants," so she says here, ano here, your honored servants, who from love of you, honored, have given up all things and are shut up living in this house, have mercy on us, and may we be saved. And then she uses the honorific passive for be saved. So the direct quotation here expresses the point of view of some person, in this case St. Clare, as she addresses God. The self is St. Clare, the focus of deference is God. But here's an open question, something that I'm still trying to understand. Why does some narrative text use reverent talk while other does not? Is this different authors or different dialects or different text genres, maybe? So some conclusions from this afternoon. There's a previously undocumented system of honorifics in Timucua. There are at least two different speech styles, which you can call plain talk and reverent talk. Plain talk is characteristic of neutral third-person point of view and doesn't use honorifics. Reverent talk occurs when the text quotes a speaker who is addressing a person of higher status or a deity, and sometimes in text discussing the actions of the deity. The grammatical properties of reverent talk are not really similar to Spanish or any other European language. And this kind of extensive grammatical marking of reverence is very rare in North American indigenous languages of the US or Canada. In fact, I don't know of any other example of it north of Mexico. The Timucua system is quite similar in some ways to Nahuatl, and it probably is a linguistic reflection of the extensive social stratification of Timucua society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any questions? Hang on, Carolyn.
Thanks. It occurred to me when you were talking and you said some did not use the honorary terms. Like our society, were there people who didn't believe in their particular honorary, for lack of a better word, religious belief, and they would not use that?
I'm sure that would have been the case. So the texts that we're looking at are probably authored by Christian converts who will have this kind of particular deference system towards Catholic deities and saints. But you can see, for example, in the text where the demon refers to the bishop without respect, that a demon, for example, doesn't show respect to the bishop, but another person does. So clearly, your particular belief system or your social status influences how you will address other people.
Since all this had something to do with Christianity, how could we be sure that all this terminology would be the same in the native setting as it was after the Christian advent or before?
Well, we see it in both Christian and secular text. Of course, we don't have any pre-European text in Timucua, so in that sense we can't be sure. However, it is true that languages can't just invent grammatical systems like this out of nothing. So what I would say is that these texts to me indicate there's some pre-existing linguistic system of honor marking in Timucua, which then gets adapted to the Christian context once the Catholics arrive.
I'll just ask one final question.
Yeah.
At the FAS conference last year, I don't remember if it was you or one of your students that talked briefly about how the Adam and Eve story was translated into Timucua. And could you just give a nutshell version of that?
With respect to honorifics or more
Well,
generally?
I was thinking in terms of the status of in order to translate Adam
Yeah.
and Eve into Timucua, who would those relevant people be in Timucua society?
Yeah. Well, there is, so this is, when I talked a little bit about rare uses of honor towards parents, this might be a case with Adam and Eve. So in the text, they're constantly referred to as our first mother and our first father. And sometimes they do seem to trigger honorific marking on the verbs. That part of it is fairly unusual. So it might signal in general that maybe these sort of honorific systems often start off as sort of kinship-based systems where certain kin who are due a certain degree of respect, that respect is indexed linguistically, and from kinship systems it spreads out to other parts of society. In the Adam and Eve story, where Adam and Eve get honorific marking in some cases, we might see the original case, because what's unusual about it is Adam and Eve are not deities, they're not saints. So it's not really expected that they should be indexed with honor in these texts. But nevertheless, they sometimes are, which may be a vestige of some kinship-based honorific.